you have said, good friends with the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He's making the point that at least there are reports that he has prevented from the Chancellor, Alistair Darling, from going as far as he would like, as quickly as he would like. And yet we still have this claim that they're going to halve the deficit within 4 years. Is that possible?
Well, first of all, you're saying you don't want to comment on the British election, and you keep trying to drag me in, and I'm not going to do that. What I can tell you is that I worked with Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I was Finance Minister for a long time, and we worked very closely together, primarily on Africa. Yes, there's no doubt about it. Gordon Brown is a friend of mine, and I have enormous confidence in him.
Okay, so the time scale, but in terms of the time scale, I know you don't want to talk about the British political scene. What about the time scale? Can you cut a deficit of the order of £178 billion in 4 years?
Well, I don't know the British numbers. I know that we took a deficit that was of comparable size in Canadian terms, and we did. But I knew the Canadian numbers. I don't know your numbers.
Okay. Let's talk about Canadian politics, because we have a situation at the moment where the Conservative government has for the second time suspended Parliament. I've read people describe it as a banana republic, as embarrassing. How do you see it?
Well, it's pretty surprising. You just said it. This is the second time in a year, and it is certainly not well viewed in Canada. We've got a number of issues. We have got a deficit of our own at the present time. The government's numbers on the deficit are not in accordance with most economists' projections of what the deficit is going to be. In other words, the government's gilding the lily, a lot of people seem to feel, in terms of the deficit. We are hosting the G20 meeting this June. Climate change should be on the issue. We haven't exactly covered ourselves in glory on that issue. The government's cutting research and development. And a number of other issues. It's cutting the budgets that are going into education for Aboriginal Canadians, and these are a lot of issues which are really front and center in terms of the debate. And for the government to prorogue Parliament so that it doesn't have to face Parliament and answer questions, I think there's a lot of criticism of that.
Why isn't there more objection though? How can they get away with it for a second time?
Well, there is a lot of objection. I mean, I think that people are very, very unhappy about it.
You've been very quiet though.
Well, I essentially said that the areas that I'm going to focus on are Aboriginal Canadians, which is a matter of deep concern to me, Africa, and the G20. And those really are the three areas where I'm going to focus on. I don't think people want former prime ministers to be out there speaking on every single issue.
Okay, but tell me
unless somebody forces them into doing it.
Okay, but here you set out how difficult it was, but how ultimately successful it was to cut the deficit back in the 90s, and this vast job you went through, which affected a lot of people. It affected health and education, and yes, you put money back in, but it hit a lot of people. And now you're saying that they're gilding the lily again on the finances. Personally, how does that make you feel? You think, I went through all that.
Well, look, it's obviously it's a new government. They have a different. They're very ideological. They have a different perspective than the one I had. They cut a lot of other things that I believed in, childcare as an example, and Aboriginal education. But look, I mean, this is democracy. I've said I'm going to focus on certain areas, because I just don't think I'm going to be all over the place. I think it's far more important that a former prime minister, use his or her political capital on a certain number of areas where they can make an impact.
You once said that you didn't like politics. Do you miss it?
No, I don't. Do I miss government? I miss the ability in government, because you can do things. You can do much more in 5 minutes in government than you can do in 5 months outside of government. But if the question is, do I miss politics? Not a bit.
Because there were some people who thought you just disappeared when you left politics, and that there were some people who felt that perhaps you left your party in the lurch. Were you licking your wounds a little bit?
No, not a bit. I left. I stayed in Parliament actually up until the next election, but there was a new leader, and I don't think a new leader needs the previous leader looking over his shoulder. And I actually had gotten very involved, as I mentioned to you, in Africa, and when you're in Africa, you're not in Canada, and on the Aboriginal issue.
Okay, well, let's talk about the G20, which is why you have been here talking in the Cambridge Union. It's something that for years you pushed for, and then events rather overtook things and became the driving force. When the financial crisis happened, suddenly it was the G20 had come of age. I wonder if actually the G20 had existed earlier, whether more could have been done to prevent the difficulties.
Oh, I believe so. I think that the G20 did exist at the finance ministers level, but it did not exist at the leaders level. And the question of global imbalances, which is this huge surplus in China, the huge deficit in the United States, that would have required the leaders to deal with. I think that there had been better discussion at that point. It would have been done. Whether the whole question of the bank regulation, whether that would have been solved, I'm not sure, because I'm really not sure just the degree to which the regulators were aware of just how bad the situation was. But I do know one thing, that it's going to have to be settled at the G20 by the leaders. And that's why I am so concerned. There are 2 G20 meetings coming up now. And I think that this whole issue of bank regulation, the whole question of the bank equity, the strength of the banks, is going to have to be settled. And I think there are 2 other issues that are very important. One is climate change, and the other one is poverty in Africa. And I think that the G20 has a responsibility to deal with those issues.
Because we make the point that you have pushed for the existence of the formation, and it's a greater role for the G20. Finally it gets it, and yet you've been quite critical of what it's done thus far. It's going to have to make its case soon, otherwise people will become disillusioned with it.
Well, I think that's a very valid point. Yes, there have now been 3 meetings of the G20. There is now going to be this meeting this summer in Canada, and then in Korea. And just you look at those issues. Copenhagen was not a success. And
you were there?
I was there. Yes, I was. And the reason.
But you were there representing the Congo?
The Congo Basin forests. That's right. There are 10 countries that make up the 2nd largest forest in the world. But the issue really is that the G20, it's the signals that the G20 sends to its people. Well, they sent the wrong signals in terms of Copenhagen, because we've seen it. I mean, Copenhagen did not succeed. They've got to send the right signals this summer, because there's a meeting in Mexico, and that one on climate change has to succeed. The same thing in Africa. I mean, we have a financial crisis caused by the members of the G20, and they ignore Africa. And Africa suffered enormously from the crisis. And so what I'm really saying is, listen, you just cannot ignore the continent that has the youngest and the fastest growing segment of global population. And I think that what fundamentally the G20 has to really be about is not simply the narrow interests of the 20 countries, but it has to be one that recognizes that globalization will only work if in fact we cooperate. And if that message comes through, then the G20 will be a success.
But are they not cooperating now?
Well, if you were in Africa, if you're interested in climate change, you certainly wouldn't think they're cooperating now. Not to the extent that they have to. They're talking, but
are they cooperating in their own interests and not those who are not members of the G20?
Well, that's a very good point, and that really is that's one of the points that I was making at the Cambridge Union, which is that the purpose of the G20 is to not simply set up 20 countries, 20 powerful countries, all speaking for themselves. I mean, if the G20 is going to have any legitimacy, that they've got to recognize there are 173 other countries out there who require them to basically be speaking for them. And if the G20 does that, it's going to succeed. If it doesn't, it won't.
Why is it any more likely to do it than any other international body that thus far? I mean, things like the criticism of the G7 was that it was only representing the wealthiest. You now have the G20. How are you going to get them not to work in their own self-interest? Well,
I think what you've got to do is make them see that their own self-interest requires a world that works. So that, for instance, it's fine if everybody wants to go back into their own little corner and say climate change, but we're not going to move. Well, we're all going to suffer, and they've got to realize. I mean, the Chinese have got to understand that if they don't move, then the Americans won't move. The Americans have got to understand if they don't move, then the Chinese won't move. It's the same thing in terms of bank regulation. Look. Just take the financial crisis is the result of the American and European banking systems being imprudently regulated, going too far, doing the wrong things. Well, and now they're saying, well, okay, but we're going to do it, but we don't want to give up our sovereignty. Well, somebody better start thinking that in 5 years, when the Chinese and Indian economies are as big as the American or the European, what's going to happen if a major Chinese bank fails? What's going to happen if there's a mortgage meltdown in India? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. It's going to be voters in London or Manchester or Montreal or Munich who are going to suffer, just as people in the rest of the world have suffered because of the imprudence of European and American banks. So that question is, we are all in it together. We either work together or we hang together.